Welcome to the third Digital Academy of Behavioral Economics 2021. 8 years ago, we started the successful journey with our Academy of Behavioral Economics together with the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute. And who does not know Gottlieb Duttweiler? In a nutshell, he is the founder of the Migros, the corporation with more than 100,000 employees in Switzerland. And he was a visionary personality who donated his whole wealth to the Swiss public 60 years ago. What is our mission here? To make the valuable knowledge of behavioral economics and experimentability accessible to the public in an inspiring manner for one purpose: to make the world a better place. I'm very happy to welcome John List, Kenneth C. Griffin, Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, to the Academy of Behavioral Economics. Thank you, John, for having found the time to spend the next hour with us on the topic: the power of scalability, making great ideas successful. The University of Chicago had the privilege to host 32 Nobel Prize laureates during the last 50 years, starting with Paul Samuelson, Herbert Simon, James Heckman, Paul Romer, who was last year our guest, David Card this October, with his contribution to the natural experiments, a field very close to field experimentation. To quote Cass Sandstein, co-author of the book Nudge, and Nobel Prize winner George Akerlof, John has done more than anyone else to advance the methods and practice of field experiments. This is why he has become 2015 part of the Clarivate Citation Laureates, a list of scientists who will, with a high probability, win the Nobel Prize in the near future. John joined the University of Chicago in 2005. In 2011, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As of March 2021, John ranks as the 9th most influential economist in the world. His first popular science book, together with Yuri Gnisi, was published in 2014. The name of the book, The Y-Axis: Hidden Motives and the Undiscovered Economics of Everyday Life. And John, you remember better than I, there was this famous chapter number 3 that changed my whole view on gender topics and how we can change the behavior of people. The name of the topic was, "What can a matrilineal society teach us about women and competition?" Based on his research, some colleagues from Fair Advice, together with the Institute of Advanced Studies in Vienna, conducted a field experiment with more than 1,000 young girls in public schools. The purpose was to strengthen their confidence in STEM topics: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The field experiment was highly successful and now will be rolled out in all schools in Austria. Some of you might now think, why do we roll out the experiment? Because we are very confident about scalability of the results. Why are we so confident about the scalability? Because we used the latest research of John, the science of science, and applied the principle and rules of scalability John elaborated in his work. Ladies and gentlemen, scalability is one of the most important topics in business and in politics these days. This is why I asked John to share his latest research results with us today. John, announcing someone like you is not only fun and joy for me, it is very inspiring. I'm looking forward to your presentation and the Q&A about your future bestseller, The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. The floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you John List.
Wow. How can I follow that? That is overly generous, very much appreciated. And I want to thank all of you for giving me this forum, and thanks for starting the Academy. It's a wonderful pursuit to unlock some of the secrets in academic journals and to take the math and jargon and economies out of the work that we so often produce and read in the Academy, and bring it to the real world and try to make real change. I so appreciate everything that all of you are doing. And thanks for having me tonight. And I want to thank everyone for also attending this lecture, which without further ado, I will get started with. What I want to summarize tonight is my book called The Voltage Effect. And I'll define what I mean by the voltage effect in a few moments. But the general question is, why do so many ideas fail to deliver on their promise when scaled? Now, generically behind the scenes here, the question is, how can we use science to teach us about those broken promises? And if you're into riddles, one riddle that you might want to think about is, what can Nancy Reagan, Uber, and an early childhood program teach us about those broken promises? So where my scaling road essentially came to an important fork was when I started a preschool in Chicago Heights, along with Roland Fryer and Steve Levitt. We essentially went to a poor community that surrounds Chicago called Chicago Heights. And from scratch, we built a preschool program. Preschool in the States is effectively the ages of 0 to 6. When a child reaches 6 years old, they go to kindergarten, and then it's compulsory until you're 16 years old in the States to be at least in public education. So our idea was, let's develop a program that we can test using a field experiment, and we can explore the foundations of the education production function, but importantly, create a curriculum that everyone can use. Okay, so we started building this pre-K from scratch. You can see a picture of it. It's called the Chicago Heights Early Childhood Center. It targeted 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And in 2014, the great results came in. And at this point, I started to say, wow, we are really going to change the world. We should go and talk to policymakers so they adopt our policy, our curriculum, and every 3, 4, and 5-year-old in the world should have our curriculum along the lines of early childhood advances in executive function skills and cognitive skills. So the results were basically off the charts. Super excited. Then came the slap in the face. So the slap in the face is when I talked to policymakers, the initial response was, Professor List, your program had an impressive benefit profile, but don't expect it to happen at scale. I'm like, why is that the case? And nearly every one of them said, it doesn't have the silver bullet. I said, wow, what's the silver bullet that these people are talking about? And then they typically went on to say, John, all of the experts tell us their interventions will work, but when we actually do it, what they promise really doesn't happen. And I said, well, that's sort of interesting if that's true. And then I asked them, why do you think that's true? And at that point, they kind of throw up their arms and say, there's this new area called implementation science. And those scientists tell us it's because of fidelity, but we really don't know. Okay, so at this point, I have to do some research and say, first of all, is what they're claiming true? Is what happens in the Petri dish when it's scaled, does that typically fail? Yes, it does. That's why I titled the book The Voltage Effect, because it's essentially turning a mountain into a molehill. And what I mean by that is exactly what I said in the video. You have a great result in your test case or in your Petri dish, and then when it's scaled, it turns into a molehill. Policymakers were exactly right. So then my research agenda at that point began to think about how can we use the economic science to learn about scalability. Now, my thesis is where the policymakers were wrong is that this is not a silver bullet problem. I want you rather to think about this problem as an Anna Karenina type problem. So for all the Tolstoy fans out there, remember the first sentence in Anna Karenina, something along the lines of happy families are all alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Just change a few words, put in scaling. Scalable ideas are all alike. Each unscalable idea is unscalable in its own way. And you have a weakest link problem. Not a silver bullet, but a weakest link. And the links that I have found are what I call the 5 vital signs that we should look for in an idea before we can be confident that that idea will truly scale. So in essence, what I'm saying here is, let's do an analysis of our idea and check whether it contains these 5 vital signs, because they're going to give us insights into the breadth and depth of the idea or policy. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I want to go through those 5 vital signs. Vital sign number 1 is there was never any voltage to begin with. This is what scientists call a false positive, or the inference problem. Okay, so one example from the policy world that I talk about in the book, and this is where Nancy Reagan enters the picture. Nancy Reagan was one of the most famous first ladies in the United States. She was married to President Ronald Reagan, and she was a very, very good woman who took on the problem of drug use amongst teens. Back in the 80s, when I was in high school, there was an epidemic of sorts that had this issue of too many teens are using drugs. So Nancy Reagan pushed a campaign called the Just Say No campaign, or DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. It was essentially an education program that went across America and told people not to use drugs. I can still remember when I was sitting in the classroom and one of these representatives came in. I looked at my high school teacher and I said, there's no way this is working. I don't use drugs, but I have a lot of friends who do, and this isn't going to work. My teacher looked at me and said, John, I get it, but there is actual data behind this program. He was right. There was data. It was data from one experiment that was conducted in Honolulu. It had a lot of people. It had 1,700 people, but it was a false positive. No one ever bothered to replicate whether it was true or not, or whether even any components were true. And it would have been easily done to do so, but they didn't. We spent millions and millions of dollars and a bunch of time on a campaign that just had no voltage. Now, in the business world, this hit me when I was working for Chrysler. So at Chrysler, what we were going after was obesity of line workers. So Chrysler said, look, we have this problem where a lot of our workers are obese, and that's causing them to have both presenteeism, that means they come to work and they're not very productive, and absenteeism. So we went after that in a program based in one of their plants. And the program produced great results in that one plant. The CEO then came to us and said, John, I love these results. Let's do it in every Chrysler plant in America. We said, whoa, we better check to make sure that that result is real, that it's not a false positive before we roll it out and spend millions of dollars. So we did it again in that plant, in 2 others. Guess what? Failed. False positive. Then we pivoted and went to something new that did have voltage, and we scaled that. And it was all about just checking to make sure that your idea has true voltage. When I scoured the literature and have a bunch of data, a lot of our results that we try to scale just should never be scaled. Okay, so that's vital sign number 1. Make sure it has voltage. Vital sign number 2 is understand your audience, or understand in economies, this is called properties of the population. Here comes an example from Uber. So when I was the chief economist at Uber, I was in a car going to downtown Chicago to give a keynote lecture at the American Economic Association meetings. And I was picked up about a half hour before the lecture. So I was here in Hyde Park, Chicago. It's about a 20-minute drive. So I jumped into Uber, and the Uber starts taking me. I start, of course, typical John List fashion. I'm working on my slides. So I'm finishing my slides that I'm going to give at the talk, at the keynote. And about 5-10 minutes into the trip, I look up, I see buildings. I'm just about there. I go back to work. About 15 minutes later, I look up. I'm back in front of my house. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening here? The driver said, I'm so sorry. The app blinked and it said to take you back to your house. I said, no, take me back to the conference. So the driver took me back to the conference. I was about 15 minutes late. I gave my talk. But that evening, I called the founder and CEO of Uber, and I let him know, Travis Kalanick, I let Travis know what I thought about his blankety blank app, and that I will never use Uber again. And he said, John, I apologize, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, you know what the worst thing was, Travis, is that Uber never apologized to me. And he said, well, John, we haven't gotten to that. And I said, Travis, we have now. So my team at Uber, it's called Ubernomics, invented a product called the Uber Apology Program, that whenever somebody received a bad trip, we would send them an apology and also a $5 off coupon. Now, we rolled that out and it looked great. So then we rolled it out to everyone. In the end, though, that apology program only worked for the slice of Uber users who were new users. So once you understand the population that it works for is only new Uber users, the rest of the users we were given the $5 coupon to was a complete waste of money. So before scaling it all the way up, we should have said, look, who does it work for? Focus on them and then develop a new product for the people who the apology program doesn't work for. And that's now where the Uber program is now, using AI and machine learning to make sure that we understand the population it works for. Now, in the policy world, there are a lot of examples of this happening. One example is anemia. So we know that anemia really is a worldwide problem. A lot of experts say roughly 1.6 billion people are affected by anemia worldwide. Now, the major reason scientists argue is because of iron deficiency. That's a leading cause of anemia. So what they did in India is they ran some small-scale studies that showed that double fortified salt worked for young females. Now, surprisingly, they took that and in 2012 did a nationwide scale up. You can imagine what happened. Didn't go very well at scale. It worked for young females, but not for everyone else. A true voltage drop because they didn't understand the population that it would work for. That's vital sign number 2. Vital sign number 3 is this changes from the people to the situation. In the book, I say, is it the chef or is it the ingredients? Because when you look at restaurants that scale and scale well do so because of their ingredients. The restaurants that don't scale well is the secret sauce was the chef. And as it turns out, humans just don't scale very well. So if you have an idea that revolves around a human, typically won't work. Now, in the policy world, an example is smart technology. So this is a technology that goes in your house and it moderates the temperature in your home. It's called smart thermostat, smart technology. We understand that this technology works largely from engineering estimates. Now, engineers assume that pretty much everyone is Dr. Spock. Who's Dr. Spock? He's this inherently rational, unswervingly calculating agent that can do really hard math problems at the drop of a hat. That's what engineers pretty much assume. Now, when you look at the real world, that's, of course, a lot of Homer Simpsons. A lot of people make mistakes around this smart technology. In fact, in a study that we have forthcoming, the dumb humans completely undo the smart thermostat in that all of those great enthusiastic engineering estimates are completely undone because they don't forecast that it's the human that can actually reverse the initial settings in the smart technology. Now, within Check, this example is when you do a research project like Check, you need to understand what are the non-negotiables. Now, in this way, the non-negotiables might be you have to have great teachers. So if you have to have great teachers, now you should understand that when I scale this idea, will I continue to have great teachers at scale? So what I'm arguing in this part of the book is you need to forward look and say, what are the constraints that we have in place at scale? And we need to bring those constraints back to the original research. And instead of talking now about evidence-based policy, we really should be talking about policy-based evidence. Forward-looking designs that are saying, what are the constraints or flaws at scale? If I put those flaws in my research design, do I still get high voltage? If I do, great. The properties of the situation will be met. If not, I need to pivot. And I should not scale something that does not have the warts that you invariably have at scale. Okay, so that's the third bin, chef for ingredients. The fourth one is spillovers. We need to understand the spillovers of our ideas. Now here, let's think about what happened. Again, let's go back to Uber. And in January of 2017, there was a big campaign around the world called Delete Uber. Now, this campaign happened because President Trump in January 27th put out an executive order on immigration. That executive order stimulated a lot of anger, and the cab drivers around JFK, the airport in New York, went on strike. Now, what Uber did then was they said, look, we're going to turn off surge all around JFK. So I think Uber was trying to do a good thing, but it backfired. What happened was a cab driver saw that and argued that, look, they're trying to break the strike, when really I think what Uber was trying to do was not steal a bunch of money from consumers who didn't have the ability to take a taxi. But nevertheless, that cab driver put out a tweet that said, delete Uber. That killed Uber. In fact, back then, Lyft, who's Uber's main competitor in America, Lyft was basically dead. They were on the mat getting killed by Uber. This Delete Uber campaign put Lyft back on the map. Okay, so as chief economist at Uber at the time, Travis came to me and said, you need to get drivers back. You need to get them back on the platform. So the idea then was my team introduced tipping in the app. Before 2017, you could not tip through the Uber app. So the idea was we are going to put tipping on the app, and that will raise drivers' wages. What we found is in some beta tests that drivers who had tipping actually earn more, and then they like to drive more because they earn more. Okay, all that's great. Then we rolled it out in the summer of 2017 to all drivers in a market. Guess what happened? Drivers liked it, so they drove more. But because they drove more, that completely undid the tipping effect in the terms of raising their wages, so much so that now drivers were working more, but they were driving around empty. So in the end, they were making the exact same amount of money per hour as they were before tipping. And that's called a general equilibrium effect, in that the market came to a new equilibrium and it undid all of the good stuff that the tipping was meant to do to increase driver wages. Okay. Another kind of spillover is what happened in Chicago Heights. There were spillovers between treatment kids and control kids. And what I mean by that is, if you were a control kid, and that what that means in Czech is that you signed up for our program, but you never received our program. You were in the group that was withheld receipt. But what happened in our experiment is some of those control kids lived nearby treatment kids. In the experimentalists on this call will say, wow, John has a SUTVA violation. You're right, he does in this experiment. But it's a really interesting SUTVA violation in that if you were a control kid and lived close to 11 treatment kids, it was like you were in treatment yourself. That's how the spillovers worked in that program. So this part of the book talks about understanding these kinds of spillovers, understanding general equilibrium effects before we scale our ideas. Vital sign number 5, a lot of you might have been waiting for this. You might have been thinking, well, signs 1, 2, 3, and 4, these are all on the demand side. What about the supply side? And you're exactly right. So the supply side can be thought of as a simple figure. Does your idea have economies of scale, or does it have diseconomies of scale? So think about Czech. If I only have to hire 30 teachers in a market, that's one thing. But if I want to maintain the quality, that's the properties of the situation, that's vital sign number 3. If I want to maintain really high quality teachers, but in the same input market, I need to hire 30,000 teachers, what's going to happen? I need to go up the supply curve, and I'm going to lose voltage, not on the demand side, but on the supply side. Because remember, we're always doing benefit cost analysis, and the voltage drop can happen just as easily on the supply side. And a lot of our ideas that look great turn out not to be so great because of diseconomies of scale. Now, when you look at businesses in America that have made it big, when you look at what Elon Musk does, what Jeff Bezos does, Uber, Lyft, Facebook, etc., all of them have the fundamental feature of economies of scale. And that's a deep way to early on have a competitive or comparative advantage through the supply side. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, John just went through a bunch of examples to show his 5 vital signs of a bunch of things that can fail and gave us a bunch of warnings. How about a few things that work? One example is when we think about vaccinations. And this example is about polio vaccinations or Jonas Salk. So in the typical way, Salk early on used his own kids as his experimental subjects. Look, I do the same thing. I have 8 kids, and anytime I have an idea about a new program that I want to run, I'll run that idea on one of my 8 kids. And I even have a good treatment and control group because I have a set of twins. So I have kind of the perfect randomization there across my ideas. Salk did the same thing. He did it first with his own kids. He then tried it with a bigger group and a bigger group, and he found that his idea was not a false positive. He then found that his idea works for every kid. Now, when you get to the situation, this is where it gets a little bit harder, because he has to think about delivery. So in the medical world, a big scale-up problem is not in the innovation. It ends up being in the delivery. So if we have to take a pill, is there appropriate medication adherence? If we have to get a vaccination, do we have a good chance to get it in people's arms? Now, here's the brilliance behind the polio vaccination, is that it's given through the healthcare system. So for all of us who have had kids, we know what happens. You have a child, baby comes out, everyone's happy, they get some vaccinations. You bring your child back in 6 months for a checkup, they get some vaccinations. You bring them back in a year, get some vaccinations. The polio vaccination is one of those that leverages the healthcare system. So it brilliantly takes on that adherence or the deliverability mechanism that we're grappling with now with COVID. Now, in terms of the fourth vital sign, absolutely has great spillover effects. That's what's great about the polio vaccination. And then when you look at the supply side, after you take care of the element of the delivery, now we're home free, because we know that the big cost was in the innovation. That's what always happens with R&D. You know, producing the pills or producing the vaccine ends up having a very deep economies of scale relationship. Okay, that's in the public policy world. You might want to ask about, what about in business world? Probably all of us have looked at a screen like this. This is a screen for Lyft. It gives you the price of a ride. So guess what happens when you open your Uber app? If you get a price of $7.94 versus $7.93, you probably won't notice that particular difference in price. However, if you get a price of $8 and $7.99, you will notice the difference. And the reason why is because of what's called left digit bias from the literature. Humans tend to focus on the leftmost digit. Okay, you can say, how strong is that result? In our data in rideshare, that penny change from $7.99 to $8, from $8.99 to $9, from $31.99 to $32, that penny change is responsible for 50% of the reason why the demand curve slopes downwards. 50% of the reason for the law of demand. The other 50% is the other 99 cents in that change. Okay, we can leverage that insight and price Lyft or Uber according to left digit bias to make the world a better place. So we first find that it's not a false positive. We also find it works for everyone. Nearly everyone has left digit bias. We also find that it works in nearly every situation, whether it's morning commute, afternoon commute, dinner time, bar time, rain, going to the airport. This left digit bias is across situations. Now, in terms of spillovers, the beautiful thing about this idea is I can turn it on and off as I please. Unlike tipping, once a driver has tipping, they don't want to take it away. But I can do this type of pricing, $8.04 or $7.99, depending on what the market looks like. And then, of course, it also has great economies of scale because I'm giving a price anyway. Okay, so this is a business idea that checks all of the boxes. Now, to close, I just want to say, after you have a great idea that's launched, that doesn't mean that we cannot continue to make the idea better and we just let it go without any serious management. And this is what I call the 4 little economic secrets of making sure that after we launch a high voltage idea, it remains with high voltage. And these are just like the first part of the book. These are all mistakes that I see happening in all the organizations that I deal with. Thinking on the margin, or not quitting soon enough, or setting up a culture that doesn't scale, or setting up incentives that don't scale. These are simple approaches to making sure that our idea will maintain voltage. Okay, so that's the book in a 30-minute whirlwind tour. So I can stop sharing now and turn the stage back over to the boss.
Thanks, John. I think what was really very interesting for me is that you have a checklist. I call this the 5 item, or the big 5, how you call it, checklist. It's do I have false positive? Is it the right population? In what kind of situations does it work or not? And there comes the first question in for principle number 3. You call it chief ingredients versus technology. The question here is this something where you are advocating for artificial intelligence, for let's say machine learning, in a way that you have to get here some automation into it from the moment on? You have human, let's say, ingredients inside. Scalability is per nature more difficult.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm advocating 2 things here. One, in our original research, I want scholars to not only explore tests of theory and explore whether the program works or not. What I want them to do is reverse the typical way we think about developing evidence by saying, I have a forward-looking experiment, and I know that if this idea is scaled, it's going to have these 2, 3, 4, 5 constraints at scale. So I want to bring those constraints back to my original design and perhaps do a multi-site trial, or explore both the properties of the population of people that it works for, while also, which we do a lot of as scientists, but what we don't do a lot of is explore or block on situational features. So for check, what that would call upon is I should have a deep sample of bad teachers. And I should explore, does my idea work with bad teachers the same way it works with middling teachers and great teachers? The reason why I want to oversample bad teachers is because when I scale it up, it's likely the case that I'm going to have to employ a lot of bad teachers if I have the same budget. So that's point 1. Now, point 2 is you're spot on. What I'm also calling for is machine learning and AI to help us learn about the features of the population and the features of the situation when our ideas will work. So it's not only how you analyze the data, which is machine learning and AI, but it's also the data that you generate in your designs.
This, not to hide, this question was from Thomas Farni. I mean, we have a colleague of you here. Maybe you know him. He's a pioneer in experimentation. It's Michael Schrage.
Absolutely.
And he is very, very politely asking a question, giving your Uber background experience, that he would like to ask you whether you can comment on the role of network effects in promoting and enabling voltage. Because network effects is more or less, let's say, efficiency, and it's also economies of scale for sure. No,
absolutely. A great question. So I want you to think about network effects, let's say 2 ways. The first way is, let's put Facebook in our minds. So if you ask somebody who doesn't have any friends who use Facebook or any acquaintances, what is the value to you of Facebook? They will say it's pretty small. But if you ask somebody, what is the value to Facebook if you have a zillion friends on Facebook? Now it becomes valuable because of network externalities. So when more people join, that service makes it more valuable. So you're exactly right, Michael. What happens is early on, maybe in the Petri dish, it doesn't look like it's a very effective product. But if your idea has network externalities, meaning in this first example, if a lot of other people have it, it's more valuable to you. That's what I call in the book high voltage. That's an idea that because of network externalities, it becomes a lot more powerful at scale. And you're exactly right to point out, Uber is more valuable when you have a thick market on both sides, because it gives me a lower price when there are a lot of drivers, and it gives me a lower ETA. So that's something that it's predictable though, right? That in the Petri dish, it might not have great network externalities, but as it goes up, it's going to have great network externalities. And then as Gerhard mentioned, it also links to other kinds of spillovers as well, like economies of scale and other features like general equilibrium effects that are going to matter at scale a lot more than they matter in the Petri dish. 100%.
Thank you very much. Then we have a question of Alex Pesiak, which is also interesting. You mentioned it already, I think in principle number 2, when I'm right. It's more or less that he says, hey, scaling without iteration, he calls it quite politely, is optimistic. You could say it's overconfidence poor. Teams that iterate tend to outperform those that do not. And KPI iteration, maybe you can link this to the 5 principles.
Yeah, no, 100%. So what I've learned, it's really interesting. It's sort of ubiquitous in the academy, in the business world, in government, is that the researcher has a great idea, they test it. Typically, they do an efficacy test. Now, in medical trials, they haven't figured out because they say, look, the first test is efficacy, but then phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, these are going to be designed as boundary conditions, or they're going to be designed to figure out who's, where's, and when's. But in the social sciences, we do an efficacy test, we publish it, we forget to tell everyone it was an efficacy test, and then we go and do our thing with another new project and another great idea. Because why? Because why do a replication if none of the top journals will take it or none of the foundations will fund it? So we fundamentally are broken on that dimension. But business and policymakers sort of do the same thing. They read about an idea in an academic journal. They automatically say, well, that's the truth. They say it's the truth because it's in a published and peer-reviewed academic journal, where they don't understand what all was behind that and the situational and population features. So when they adopt it, and a lot of times when somebody sees a great idea, they want to run as fast as they can with the idea because they say, let's give it to everyone. That was my point with Tom Lasorda and Chrysler. Tom saw the great idea and said, let's give it to everyone. Travis saw our great ideas on apologies. Let's give it to everyone. It's the move fast and break things mentality that ends up getting very fast runners running in the wrong direction. And in that way, that's why we have so many scaling issues or lack of scaling. Now, my book is not to slow things down. It's just to backward induct from what we truly need at scale and give policymakers and business people the data and evidence they need. And then you're exactly right. Even after you scale it, you should still be iterating because things evolve in the field. And there's an entire field about what should we be doing after scaling to make sure that we have voltage.
Maybe coming to the next question is, it's from Jan Wermuth, and he says that he has the feeling that the word experiment is terribly misused in business meaning, as trial and error rather than controlled knowledge production, or you can say, and maybe here I can add less an experience from my side. Before you scale, before you even start to ask yourself to scale, if you have an experiment that fails, you have a lot of opportunity cost saves because you don't have to even think about scaling. So it's from our main purpose to advocate for experiments is that you save a lot of time and money because you can really sort out the non-performers, and what you are advocating is that the performers are even still not performing because they're not scalable. So strategy become much less complex because you have a data environment which tells you where to go. But the question of Jan, sorry, is we should really advocate in business that experiments are truly what they need because it's as he said, controlled knowledge production.
That's wonderful. So let me start with your point about we need data to make sure that our idea will work, and that's a fundamental point that you're making that is spot on, because when I work with organizations, a lot of times they say to me, experimentation's costly and we don't have the time to do it. And I always tell them that the opportunity cost of not knowing the truth will be a lot more expensive than the time we spend, which is a very short period of time, to find out the truth. And what you're bringing up is opportunity cost of time is often neglected. And that's what I talk about in chapter 9 about winners quit. We don't quit things soon enough because we don't appreciate and respect the opportunity cost of time. Now, the question is spot on as well, because the colloquial use is exactly as the questioner said. I talked to a business person, they said, yeah, we experimented with that. I talked to a policymaker, we experimented with that. What they mean is that they tried it, and to them, it didn't seem to work. But trying it was going out with no control group. That's the fundamental problem in organizations, is a control group. They usually, their first instinct is just to put everyone through it. And then, well, if it didn't do as well as what we thought it should, or didn't do as well as it did last year, that means it didn't work. That's fundamentally a problem of what we call internal validity. You don't have a proper comparison group. That's 99% of the issues in experimentation, is there's no control. So the question's right. Now, if I was so powerful to be able to make name changes, which I've tried, right? I've tried to call stuff natural field experiments, frame field experiments, etc. I've probably had limited success doing that. So I'm not sure if I'm successful or powerful enough to change the discussion, but I do think it's a very important point.
Our experience is from the moment on, you can call it experiment, you know that you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Because the framing, and this is, we really learned in a lot of projects that we had. And the second part, maybe I can complement this, is the biggest threat on the top management side is the hindsight bias.
Yeah. Yeah.
That at the end, the results in the experiments are then what they have always said. So never always ask in the beginning the hypothesis that you can check them. Otherwise, you're hindsighted all day long. So we are at the end, dear John. Thank you very much for your time and the presentation of your research or your book and the Big Fives. I'm really inspired, and I was able to gain a lot of insights. Thank you very much. Last but not least, stay with us. On May 4th, the 9th Academy of Behavioral Economics will take place at the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute. We had to postpone it due to COVID. If you want to be there, you can register from today. There will be another firework of behavioral economists with many top speakers. Hopefully, John will also be there. Felix Oberholzer has already confirmed, and Rafaela Sadun is on the list. In the end, there is only one thing left for me to say. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us on the journey to make the world a better place every day. It's important. Good evening. Thank you very much.